pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Justin McDaniel is the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Endowed Professor of the Humanities in the Department of Religious Studies here at Penn. Justin has degrees from Boston College, Harvard Divinity School, and Harvard University. His research includes Lao, Thai, Pali, and Sanskrit literature and art and architecture and manuscript studies. His first book, Gathering Leaves and Lifting Words, won the Harry Benda Prize. His second book, The Lovelorn Ghost and Magic Monk, won the Kahn Prize. His third book, Architects of Buddhist Leisure, was supported by grants from the NEH and Kyoto University. He has two new books coming soon, Wayward Distractions, Studies in Thai Buddhism, and Cosmologies and Biologies, Siamese Illuminated Manuscripts. He's also published edited volumes on Asian manuscripts, material culture, Buddhist biographies, Buddhist art, Buddhist ritual, and Buddhist literature. He's published over 100 articles and book reviews on a wide variety of subjects in Buddhist studies, material culture, and of course, religious studies. He's also has new work coming soon on the study of human flourishing and discipline of religious studies. He's received grants from NEH, Mellon, Rockefeller, Fulbright, Luce, and SSRC, among others. He's the co-editor of the journals Buddhism Compass, Journal of Lao Studies, and the associate editor of the Journal of Asian Studies. He's won teaching and advising awards at Harvard University, Ohio University, University of California, and the Ludwig Prize for Teaching at Penn. He was named one of the top 10 most innovative professors in America by the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2019, and his work on pedagogical methods and controversial courses, Existential Despair and Living Deliberately, has been featured on NPR, Huffington Post, Washington Post, and many other locations and venues. 2019, he was named Guggenheim Fellow, and in 2014, a Fellow of Kyoto University Center for Southeast and Asian Studies. His soon work includes edited books on Thai manuscripts, Buddhist biographies, and Buddhist ritual. And he's presented many spaces, and we're so lucky to have him here tonight. We're looking forward to hear him on the topic of the birthplace of Buddha and other failures. So what an interesting title tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Justin McDaniel.
Thank you very much for that really kind introduction. I'm excited to be here competing against the Phillies and the Sixers. And this will be much better, by the way, than the Phillies and the Sixers. And they're not important games anyway, so we don't need to worry about it. This talk will be maybe not what you're expecting based on the theme of the lecture series, because the theme of the lecture series being on UNESCO sites of great importance and historical importance and cultural importance and all those things, yes, I am going to talk about one of those sites, but I'm going to talk about sites like it and the site itself that have been largely failures, that have been kind of grand experiments in creating historical moments and honoring the historical past and the religious past in terms of Buddhism, but haven't worked out very well. But before we do that, we're going to start with a roller coaster. So this is a sign in the suburbs of Saigon, or Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, for a roller coaster. And why would I start with this? It's because it's the world's first Buddhist roller coaster. This roller coaster has the cars have Buddhas on the front, like statues on the front. And it's a great roller coaster, and you can ride the roller coaster with Buddhas on it. And it's part of a much larger park, amusement park, and it's not the only Buddhist amusement park in the world, but it's part of a growing trend of Buddhist parks, or really ecumenical parks, and I'll talk about what I mean by ecumenical later. So there's laser light shows and fountains, and here we have a mixture of Confucian traditions, Taoist traditions, local Vietnamese gods and goddesses and ancestor gods, and Buddhist figures as well. In the middle of this amusement park is a large Buddhist temple, right in the center of the park, and you can see this temple is quite interesting, and you enter through this dragon's mouth up the stairs into the temple, and it looks kind of garish in some ways, but it's a fully functioning temple, and nuns like the one featured here are chanting constantly Buddhist texts, and then you have Buddhist rituals, you can make offerings, there's meditation, everything right in the center of an amusement park. And this carries on to other parts of it. This is my son many years ago inside this amusement park. And this is Vietnam. If you've ever been to southern Vietnam or northern Vietnam, you'll know that there is no snow. You might see some frost in the middle of the winter in the high mountains, but you're never going to get snow or any sort of frost in Ho Chi Minh City. At that day, it was 97 degrees Fahrenheit outside that room, but they made a room so you could sled inside and that kids could come and play, and there's themes of like Switzerland, like pictures of Switzerland and things in the back. And right next to it is this large water park, and so you can see it is warm outside. And these are Buddhist statues. They have statues of gods coming from the Vietnamese historical tradition and ancestors of great generals there, but you can slide down large dragons, and you can climb over different kind of Buddhist symbols and things like that, and play in the park, and you can have ice cream. But then constantly in this park, you're hearing Buddhist chanting outside. You're seeing parades of monks and nuns that come regularly through the park. There's a crocodile farm which you can feed crocodiles. They have elephants playing soccer. It's this massive, wonderful place. And clearly, I've done a few things right in my life. The fact that I get to research at a place like this, which my children when they were young. And so I wanted to show this as an example of many types of sites that are popping up throughout Asia. And I like to call these sites of Buddhist leisure. And the architects that build them as architects of Buddhist leisure. And I'll explain what I mean by that later. This talk, looking at many sites like this amusement park in Saigon, has three kind of general arguments I'm going to make, loose arguments. One is that they are ecumenical everywheres, meaning that they are trying to bring together Buddhists in general. When we teach religion at Penn or in any other place, whether we're teaching Islam or Judaism or Christianity, Hinduism or Buddhism or anything, is that generally we talk about, as we should, what those religions are good at, right? Is that Islam has probably the richest and largest tradition of jurisprudence of any religion. So if you want to learn about kind of the history of religious law, Islam is the place to do it, okay? If you want to look at, say, art and architecture and the kind of a panoply of gods and goddesses and how to depict it, well, you want to look at Hinduism. Hinduism is wonderful at this, okay? And every religion has something that they're known for. They're usually known for many things, and we talk about these things. We talk about their texts, and we talk about their doctrines, and their history, and their art, and their architecture. What we often don't talk about is what those religions are really bad at, and what's missing in them. And Buddhism is good at many things, meditation teaching, and in social ethics, and art and architecture, and all of these things that you know or people know about Buddhism, and they're good things. But Buddhists are really bad at a lot of things. And one of those things is coming together. Buddhists are incredibly comfortable at being internally diverse as a religion. There has never been any effort at empire building among Buddhists. So we have individual Buddhist governments, of course, and Buddhist patrons of emperors and kings and queens and things like that, but not an effort as the religion in general to form something like a caliphate or something like the Catholics would call the church, an overarching organization where members of that religion would come together. Incredibly comfortable with that diversity. There's never been a Buddhist type of Vatican or Mecca. There's never been a central Buddhist pilgrimage place. There's not a Buddhist sacred language, whereas if you were Jewish or Muslim, and you were a relatively serious practitioner, it would be unheard of that you wouldn't know Hebrew or Arabic. That would be ludicrous, is that of course you would study these languages. And in fact, that is believed to be what God speaks. God would speak Hebrew, or God would speak Arabic according to this, that this is the natural sacred tongue. Buddhists have no concept of this. is that there isn't a Buddhist language. Whether you are an 82-year-old Korean nun, or you are an 8-year-old Burmese novice, or you are a layperson in Tibet, or you are a truck driver in Laos, all of these different Buddhists are equally Buddhist. That it doesn't matter if they don't know classical Chinese or Pali or Sanskrit, these classical languages of Buddhist literature. You don't need to know any of these. There are rarely Buddhist conferences where Buddhists come together. Lately, after 1956, there started to be some of these, but really they've largely been failures. I used to be a translator at one of these conferences, and you'd sit in a booth with your headphones, and I would be listening to languages that I'm familiar with and then translating it. And these are largely places that people didn't show up, is that you don't have Buddhists really coming together. And there's been efforts to it, but those efforts have largely been by Westerners to bring Buddhists together. So for example, in French Indochina and Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, nowadays, what they're called now, is that the French came in and they were shocked that the Cambodians and the Laos didn't have what they thought were important Buddhist texts in their own language, is that there was no Buddhist canon in Lao or in Khmer. And this would be like going to Poland and having no copy of the New Testament in Polish. It's ludicrous. I mean, why wouldn't they have their own texts, their important text in their own language? And it's because it simply wasn't important, this idea that you would have one central text, one Buddhist Quran or Buddhist Bible or Buddhist Torah for Buddhists. Buddhists have not made efforts to do that. You can be a perfectly good Buddhist and have never heard of the Lotus Sutra. You can be a perfectly good Buddhist and never have heard of the Dhammapada. And these are hugely important texts in Buddhism, but they're just not shared across the Buddhist world very widely in terms of bringing all Buddhists together. And so Buddhists just aren't very good at getting together, but they're very good and very comfortable at being diverse. And these sites that I'll look at in this talk reflect that. But they also reflect a new effort to say, how can we create places that all Buddhists would be comfortable, and all people, they're not closed off to any other religion, without having one Buddhism represented. And so these sites are really no more than the sum of their parts, that they create an atmosphere, but it's an atmosphere and an ecumenicalism without an agenda. Is that you don't walk into one of these places and become converted or have a central place to go or a central ritual to do. You can wander around. You don't have to enter in any single building. You don't have to enter at a certain time or leave at a certain time. There isn't a centralized ritual. These sites bring together Buddhists, but don't make a Buddhist program or Buddhist central teaching out of them. The second argument I'm going to be making is accumulative besideness. And besideness is a term coined by Melissa Gregg. And that this is an idea that, she's not talking about these sites, but I'm drawing on her idea, that these sites that I'll be looking at is that they don't, in a sense, have a single message. That they don't try to funnel you in physically in terms of the architecture, as we'll see, but also in terms of a schedule or having a ritual that you would all show up at the exact same time and chant the exact same text and stand up at the same time and kneel at the same time or meditate at the same time or any of these things, is that they are open, but they are full. They are absolutely full of things. Is that you have statues everywhere, you have incense, you have flowers, that they're absolutely overwhelming these sites. And that you get lost in this maze of wonder when you're there. And there's no Buddhist-specific teaching going on, that you don't have, in a sense, you don't go to one of these sites and then come out of it and say that I learned something about Buddhism specifically. I learned a particular doctrine, or I learned a particular bit of history or something like this, is that you're overwhelmed by the besideness, that things happen along the way. And these are a series of distractions, and they teach in a certain way. They teach a way of being Buddhist in a way that doctrines or logical progressions or ethical standards wouldn't do. And so that they aren't what you would think of as trying to promote religion. And so this is not a secret way of getting little children playing in a water park to become somehow more Buddhist. That it's not hitting you over the head like that. And that I argue in this, and this is also Michael Taussig talks about this, about architecture in general, is that distractions are a form of learning and a form of non-discursive learning. And I hope you see that in this talk. There's are sites of accumulation. They're sites of accretion. They're not systematic, and they're not narrative. They teach, in a sense, by immediacy on the one hand and forgetting on the other hand. And this is the way we can think of these sites as Buddhist and as monuments and as important historically, but they're more like museums than they would be like temples or synagogues or churches. Is that I've been at this museum. I used to come here as a child. I grew up quite close to here. And I've worked here for 13 years now. And I have taken students on tour here. My children went to camp here. I know this museum back and forth. And I guarantee if you asked me where a particular thing was in the museum, I would have no idea. I've seen it probably 100 times. I've walked by it, but what's it next to or what's it next, I would forget because there's so much stuff here. I mean, there's over 1 million pieces in this museum, and 95% of it has never been seen by the public, is that it's all in storage. I mean, we have a massive collection of samurai armor here. It's never been shown. We have huge amounts of Korean games, Korean board games from history. Never been shown. So, and this over and over and over, just piles and piles. And they're not actually kept in piles. They're kept nicely, and they're cataloged well, and you can see pictures of them online. I mean, some of my students and other people have helped catalog these things. So they're kept really well, and they're protected. But there's so much, there's this accumulation of things that creates a sort of atmosphere of wealth, an atmosphere of wonder, an atmosphere of intrigue. But you don't actually learn from it. The vast majority of things here you don't learn, and you forget. You forget that we have them. And that goes on many sites are like this. And we go through our days like that. Most of our days are not actively remembering things. Most of our days are forgetting most things that we say. The third argument is just really brief, but what I like to call local optima. Local optima means when we study an architectural site, okay, any famous piece of architecture in the world, anything UNESCO worthy or, Pritzker Prize worthy, is that we think of the architect. We want to know the date that it was built. We want to know the materials that it was built at. We want to know the style, anything that's important, and kind of that we see that monument as timeless, right? Is that it was built at a certain time by a certain visionary. If we know their names, great in the past. If we don't, fine too. But in modern architecture, of course, that you would say, oh, that's a Giri, really, that we know exactly what that is. But any site that we see, any of the sites I'll show you, and then really any building, this building is a perfect example of this, is that the origin date tells you almost nothing, and the architect tells you almost nothing. Is that, yes, that architect will have certain styles, he or she will have certain ways of doing things, but they never work alone. Is that all architects and all monuments exist in kind of a network. Okay? And that you can have a vision of something. Say you have Angkor Wat in Cambodia. The King Jayavarman VII, who didn't found Angkor Wat, but most of the construction was under his reign, is that you can say, okay, associated with his reign, that he wanted these types of images, that he wanted this type of layout. But in reality, you're not controlled by that. You're controlled by the availability of materials, the availability of labor. In modern places, in modern times, you're controlled by city codes, by strikes, by labor unions, all of these things that affect anything. And so by the time a building is actually built, it has gone through so many compromises. And it's never the optimum of the building. It's gone through so many local optima, meaning that you're just settling a lot of times. And a lot of these places we're going to look at are settling, that we say, okay, they wanted to do this, the architect wanted to do this, but they couldn't. There's too many forces at play. And then after that, is that long after the architect has passed away, long after the initial builders are all gone, and that site has existed through time, is that people will change the building. Is that they're actively changing. This building, again, perfect example, as much as it's changed over the last 100 years. This building is interesting. There used to be the first Buddhist temple in Pennsylvania was in this museum. It was a functioning Buddhist temple, and it was started by a professor here in 1924, I believe. And actually, he had all this Buddhist objects. And this is it was great to be a professor back then, because all you had to do to become a professor is that he had a lot of money and he donated a bunch of art here. He had no degrees, and he donated a bunch of art and they gave him a professorship. So, but he didn't teach many classes. But he had all this stuff, and he opened up a Buddhist temple, and he found that Buddhists were coming to the museum to worship because it was their only place to do it. And so this place, the idea that you would have a functioning Buddhist temple in a museum in a university founded by Ben Franklin would be ludicrous. But this building has had that little bit of history and has lots of other things that have happened here as well. So any building is that the architect has to make compromises, and that we have to see a site as kind of what I like to call low-level adaptive algorithms, is that constantly calculations are being made about how to kind of get the most out of something, or to settle on something, or just to get it done. Today I'm going to focus on 3 architects. If we have time, I'll do 4 and 5. I just don't think I'll have time, but we can look at others. But we're going to focus on 3. Kenzo Tange, Lekwiriapan, and Shifa Zhao, who I just saw a couple weeks ago, actually, in Singapore. And we're going to see how these sites, I hope, shed light on these arguments that I'm making. So, first is Kenzo Tange. Anybody who studied modern architecture will know who Kenzo Tange is. One of the most famous architects of the 20th century, Pritzker Prize winner, the chair at Harvard Design School, the kind of preeminent chair of design is the Kenzo Tange chair. He was trained by and colleagues with some of the most famous architects of the 20th century, coming out of Spain and France and the United States. Unbelievable, all the things that he did in his life. St. Mary's Cathedral in Tokyo, very famous. If that looks familiar, a copy of it, sort of a copy, was made in San Francisco. So if you've seen, there's a cathedral in San Francisco, it looks very much like that. But that's St. Mary's Cathedral, a Catholic cathedral in Tokyo. The Yokohama Museum, quite a revolutionary space as a museum. You probably recognize that hotel if you've ever seen the movie Lost in Translation, one of the grandest hotels in Tokyo that he was designed by him. And one of his most famous sites is the Hiroshima Memorial for the atomic bomb dropping in Hiroshima. An absolutely famous site and a beautiful monument to go see. Also, the Olympic Stadium, 1964. You know you've made it as an architect if you get to design the Olympic Stadium, right? Is that these are quite rare. But Tokyo Radio Tower and one of the major civic halls of Tokyo. But then he designed other things. The whole city of Abuja in Nigeria is Kenzo Tange's design, so he designed an entire city. He designed the museums in Dallas and in Paris, and he has lots of hotels and major buildings all throughout the world, and a couple private homes as well, and he built his own home. But his career actually started as a failure. So as famous as Kenzo Tange was, and I got to know his family in my research, and they still run an architectural firm, one of the biggest ones in Japan, they gave me access to their old blueprints and old documents from their father. And his first design was an absolute failure. He went out for his first contest. He wanted to be the architect to help design the Palace of the Soviets. But the Palace of the Soviets, because of World War II, was canceled, and the metal was used. They actually built a superstructure, but the metal was taken down for weapons and things like that. He failed that. He didn't win that prize. And then he won a prize in 1943, of all years, for the Imperial Government of Japan in the middle of the war to design the Thai-Japanese Friendship Center in Bangkok. So the Japanese had taken over most countries in Southeast Asia. Thailand, or Siam, it was renamed Siam to Thailand in 1939, and took it over, and they wanted to, which most imperial governments do, they want to create these friendship centers. They want to kind of put their cultural stamp on the country. He won the contest to design this building, and what he did is that he designed it, and they really liked it, but they told him to make it more Buddhist, because Thailand was a Buddhist place. He had never visited Thailand. He didn't know anything about it at this time. He was a young man. And he's like, what do you mean more Buddhist? They're like, well, Thai's like Buddhism, like make it more Buddhist. And so he like changed the roof lines to look like Buddhist temples in Japan. And so it would look very odd if it was in Bangkok. And they said, okay, you got it. We really like this layout. It's good budget. It was never built because Japan lost the war and left Thailand in 1945. But the fact that he won that prize enabled him, or a commission enabled him to get other things. But his first real commission was never built because of the war. And this commission, though, this failed, unbuilt building, was actually incredibly significant because in the late 1960s, the General Secretary of the United Nations was a Buddhist. He was a Burmese Buddhist, U Thant. And he was unapologetic about promoting Buddhism as the UN General Secretary, right? And so UNESCO and places like this started to really look at Buddhist sites to preserve. At that time, I think 60% of all of UNESCO's sites were in the country of Italy. I think nowadays it's still about 35%. And so this was very skewed to Europe. And so wanted to promote this, and the UN wanted to say, let's expand outside of this and make UNESCO sites and protect the categorization at that time was a lot different than it is now, but eventually turned into what we know today as the modern UNESCO. So U Thant wanted a Buddhist architect for Buddhist sites. And so he went around looking at Buddhist sites for pilgrimage. You know, let's find the Buddhist Jerusalem, or let's find the Buddhist Rome, or let's find the Buddhist Istanbul, or something like this, a Buddhist Mecca. Let's find the Buddhist site. And Buddhists just don't promote pilgrimage sites very much. There's lots of pilgrimage in Buddhism, but they're usually local sites. But this idea that you should get to, say, Jerusalem, or should get to Mecca, or should get to the Vatican once in your life, it's just not something that is very important to Buddhists, this idea. And the sites of Buddhism, where the Buddha was born, where he gained awakening, where he gave his first sermon, these are all very important historically, but really not since about the 6th century, is that they were largely forgotten, and that Buddhists just don't really care about going to the site where the Buddha was born. It's just not important for their religion. But U Thant, in a sense, wanted something for Buddhists. He wanted a Buddhist Jerusalem, right? He wanted a Buddhist Vatican. And so he said, okay, let's go. We know where the Buddha was born. We think we know where the Buddha was born. The discovery of the Buddha's birthplace, it was known in history, but the actual site was never subject to an archaeological dig until 1901, actually. And so this is how little Buddhism started 2,500 years ago, so 500 BCE. It wasn't until 1900 CE that people thought to do an archaeological dig or make the Buddha's birthplace important, right? And it was unfortunately a German archaeologist, not unfortunately, it was a German archaeologist who did the first dig, but he had a very unfortunate name. His name was Adolf Führer. So now in 1900, that wouldn't have been a terrible name, but so we don't talk about Adolf Führer very much. I mean, he was just an architect, happened to be a German architect in 1900. But this site had been discovered, but never really developed. And U Thant went there and he said, this is sad. Buddhists should honor the birthplace of the Buddha, like where he was born. This was his house. This was the tree, supposedly, that he sat under. We should do something. So he wanted to create a site that would be honored and would draw Buddhists from all over the world. Kind of this UN mentality is that it's a sad that a Tibetan Buddhist and a Burmese Buddhist, Sri Lankan Buddhist, Indian Buddhist, Taiwanese Buddhist can't, in a sense, come together in one spot and have something that unites them together, that they're not linked by languages or ethnicity or history or even doctrine. Even the colors of the robes of all the monks and nuns are very different in different countries, the size of the alms bowls, the rules. When I was a monk, we had 243 rules, but in Japan, you have about 10 for a lot of monks, or maybe 49. Even the basic rules for being a monk or a nun are very different. And so he said, I want to have a site where Buddhists can come together. And I want a Buddhist architect. So he said, Kenzo Tange, he's famous. He won the Pritzker Prize. That's the Nobel Prize of Architecture. get him. They went to Khenzo Tangye, and he's like, no, not interested. Like, I have a lot of work to do and a lot more important sites than this. And this is in the middle of nowhere in southern Nepal. It's in southern Nepal, about 7 kilometers from the Indian border. He had no interest. And he's like, I don't think I'm a Buddhist. Like, he had no influence of Buddhism. He's Japanese, but his father worked for a bank in China. His father, in the 1920s, was actually working. Khenzo Tangye spent 8 years of his life in Shanghai, in a little Japanese section of Shanghai. And he's like, I've never designed a Buddhist anything. He never designed a Buddhist temple. And U Thant said, well, yes, you did, this place in Bangkok. He said, well, that was never built, and they forced me to do it. And Khenzo Tangye was deeply against this idea that he was a Buddhist architect or a Japanese architect or an Asian architect. He hated that label. He said, I'm an architect. That's it. I'm not Buddhist, I'm not Japanese, I'm Asian. I am those things, but that doesn't define me. And I don't want to be classified, but he was the most famous architect that happened to be Buddhist, and U Thant wanted him. And he said, you need to do this. He's like, okay, fine. He visited the site once. He hated it. This is the only known photograph of him there. So the architect of the entire site was there for, I think, about 8 hours and then left. And if you visit Lumbini, the town it's in the summer, you don't want to be there either. And so this is the known photograph of him there. He surveyed the site, and he sent in his plan, and he let it go. And these are the plans. He designed this whole site, and I'll show you pictures soon. This is the UNESCO site of Lumbini now. And 2 kind of circles here with a corridor in between, and places for worship and temples, and then a museum and a library that he said looked like Buddhist caves. I've never seen a Buddhist cave that looks like that, but he said. And this was built when it came, and then the architectural plan is here, and it was designed. And he said, he was asked in an interview, this is the starting of this great Buddhist site that will bring all Buddhists together, and this is 1972. And they're like, what Buddhist philosophies did you bring to your design? And clearly he had no idea what to say because he has never studied Buddhism, he died in 2005, but never studied Buddhism. And he's like, well, it's the most ridiculous article you ever read. He's like, well, I don't know, like circles and squares are universally Buddhist. I'm sorry, but what the fuck? Like, really? Like, no, like circles and squares. Like, every place has circles and squares. Like, they're not particularly Buddhist, and the design is not particularly Buddhist. And if you actually go through his records, and I talked to his son about this, he's like, these are kind of the exact same records for Abuja in Nigeria. Like, he took his designs for a Nigerian city, and he's like, I don't have time. Let's just map this onto Lumbini. Like, basically, that's what the design is. But he called it Buddhist because people wanted it to be Buddhist. Now, it really is the birthplace of the Buddha, as far as we know, from all records. But this is not a Buddhist design. But it was built. And it took a long time to build. And there was lots of failures on the way. And nothing really ever worked. The library and museum, they've been trying. There's a new director there now. I actually was just on a Zoom call with them and consulting on how do we kind of bring back Tangye's vision for this and how do we repair things. Because they opened up a museum, and within about 2 weeks, everything was stolen. So the art was gone. So now you have a museum with pictures of what used to be in the museum. The library is very nice. It's a very well-stocked library, but lots of leaking problems and lots of these. It's just he didn't understand the environment and didn't understand the conditions and didn't understand the building materials because he really wasn't invested in the place, so a lot of things started falling apart. But what was interesting is that Khenzo Tangye he was part of what was called the Metabolism School, which was really started around 1959. And this was an idea, a school of architecture that said that you should build something that can constantly adapt and constantly change, is that you should have buildings that have modules that can move, walls that can move, is that it should adapt to the people using it. And so he brought that to almost everything he did. And so in this site, he laid out many spaces for Tibetans to go here, Cambodians here, Koreans here, like spaces for each of them. Each of those countries, Buddhist organizations, those countries kind of committed to say that we will build something here, that we will be a part of your larger design. that we were going to come together. And that he largely didn't organize this, but he made the space that this would be possible, and these would be interchangeable. Is that if one group kind of declined and another group rose up, they could move into it. Is that you could take over 2 or 3 spots if you wanted to. And so it was largely designed to be adaptive. And then also the central corridor, this long vein in it, was actually really a very smart design, is that everyone has to come out of these individual pods, in a sense, to funnel into this main kind of pathway with a reflecting pond, right? Kind of like the mall in Washington, so this long reflecting pond there. And so this idea that was a good idea, that people would come and bring together, and that he said, well, that's the point of this, right? The point of it is not to be Buddhist in design. The point of it is to bring Buddhists together. And so he did that. Unfortunately, he didn't understand most of Buddhist politics and the funding that was going to happen to this. And this is largely a failed site. I've been to this site many, many times. I will tell you, and this is in all seriousness, don't go. Like, really. Lumbini is about the worst place on the planet. It is... One day I was there, it was 52 Celsius. So I think that's like 127 or something, okay? And it is the only place in Nepal you basically can't see a mountain from. And Nepal's a small country, and they have Mount Everest there. So, like, it is this crazy, like, deserted place. It was a crossroads that the Buddhist family, the Shakya clan 2,500 years ago, were largely traders and kind of landowners, but they weren't very powerful. This was an outlying area. This wasn't the center of a kingdom of any sorts. And so there's not a lot of reasons to go there. Most Nepalis would go there. Most Indians don't go there. There's no destination. There's no real river. There's no real body of water. There's no kind of mineral deposits. There's no educational systems. It is extremely sparsely populated. And so to build a site like this that has so much money coming in, has no public transit, has no easy way to get there, and then you have border issues with Nepal and India at the time, and there's still sometimes border issues. And there's also electricity issues, that the electricity can be shut off by India even though it's in Nepal, right? And so you have all water problems, all of these things. And so this was a site that was incredibly hard to build from the get-go. And it's just, no matter how much money, and a lot of money went into this, it's just failure after failure after failure after failure. And so the design was executed in some ways, but just not maintained, or it was half completed. I was interviewing a few workers at the site. Some of them started at this site in 1972, which is a long time ago because it's the year I was born. And they've lived there for 50 years, had children, and their children have grown up and have children, and they work on the site. This is a site where it's just, well, there's a little bit of trickling money that comes in, and we'll just kind of keep working on it. Kenzo Tange is long dead. He gave up but he said, like, I don't want to even make any decisions. I don't want to even talk to you, in 1979. Okay? But they still kind of execute this design. Now they're trying to wonder, now I was on the Zoom call about it, they're trying to wonder, should we keep doing this or should we scrap the whole thing? Because no matter how much they advertise and how much they promote, is that people come, if they come to see this place, to see the birthplace of the Buddha, they quickly leave. There was 2 Japanese hotels. One has largely disappeared, the other one is struggling. Is that people coming on buses and then they largely, or motorcycles, and then they largely leave quickly. Is that pilgrims are regularly very disappointed because this is the tree that the Buddha, not the one he gained awakening under, but said that he visited home and meditated under it. And these aren't monks, they're fake monks actually. And so they go there and they dress up like monks to get money from visiting tourists and things like that. And I've talked to many of them, and this is a good way for them to make money. But you have people coming from Korea and Japan and Burma and Thailand and France and the United States to come meditate with them. People donate money from all over the world. This is a famous pillar right here that King Ashoka in the 2nd century BCE, 3rd century BCE constructed, so that's an important site. That's how we kind of think that this is probably where the Buddha was born. But people don't stay. There's some markets, largely selling products. It's local Nepalis selling the products, but the products are almost all from China. Shanty towns are built by, this is a group of Bangladeshi monks, for example, that have built a shanty town because there's not really places to stay for a lot of people, and it's expensive. People come in these group tours, and they have videographers and take pictures, but they quickly move on. Some of these places that were built by individual countries, like Thailand, Thailand built a very nice, beautiful temple. It's well maintained, but they really don't get any visitors, and the monks there just want to leave. Like what are we doing here? And like, for example, this is me with a group of Thai pilgrims here, and took a photo, and I was like, so far, because I was living in Nepal, so far for you to come here and welcome you. It's like, we'll go around Nepal. They're like, no, we're leaving in an hour. Like, they got there, and they're like, take pictures, we're gone. And they wanted to get back across the border. You have meditation centers for largely Western meditators that come there, and they stay for a while, but largely don't stay for long as well. You can get a little like rickshaws, and you can go around the sites. You can do it very cheaply, or you can do it in a more expensive tour. But most people do it like this. Most people bring their own food. They set up camp, and a lot of times they're not Buddhists. This area is mostly Muslim. And some Hindus. Nepal is a Hindu kingdom, and it's mostly Hindus, but there's small groups of Buddhists, about 10%, and then small groups of Muslims, about 10%. But they come to this site as well, and I'll talk about why they do more in a second. Again, groups from Burma, groups from China coming in, and some linger around, some build their own shelters and stay here because there's not a lot of places to stay, and the one Japanese hotel is still too expensive for most people. And they see these beautiful sites, and so these are different places that different Buddhist groups built. So we have groups built by Tibetans, groups built by French Vietnamese, places built by Cambodians, but a lot of the sites start and they get halfway done and remain abandoned. This is a Korean temple that was just abandoned after about 3 years of construction. They just weren't getting anybody to come visit, so it just sits there empty, and they have one security guard just protecting an empty building. You have fancy ones, like this is French Vietnamese funded. This is German Tibetan funded, so Germans funding a Tibetan temple. Beautiful sites, actually really, really nice temples, again, in these little pods that Khenzo Tangye designed up in these that would all funnel into this main kind of rib of the park, and they're quite beautiful, but they don't really get many visitors. Then you have the Swiss temple here, which is architecturally a little out of place, but that's fine. Japanese site, again, abandoned. Cambodian site, abandoned. But this can be seen as a failure as bringing Buddhists together, a failure in terms of its architecture, a failure in terms of the economic wealth generated from it and the ability to self-sustain, right? So in all the things that the UN wanted, this has completely failed, right? And they're trying again now, and we'll see what happens over the next 10 years or so. But Khenzo Tangye actually, and I talked to his family about this, would have been quite happy, not because of what the site looks like, because it actually perfectly describes metabolism, is that this was an international site, a site that was supposed to be ecumenical, a site that was supposed to bring every Buddhist place in the world and have a miniature version of it here, and to celebrate being Buddhist. But in a sense, it really promotes the idea of non-attachment, because Buddhists themselves became very unattached to this place. But locals love it. The local Muslim community loves it. The local Hindu community loves it. They absolutely love this place because it's become a hugely important place for them for weddings. So there are not many venues where you can get married in Nepal unless you have a lot of money. Okay? That they cost a lot of money. Weddings are very expensive. And so for poorer families, they just can't get these sites. They don't have big enough homes themselves. They can't rent sites, and marriage is hugely important in every religion, in every community. So they come to this Buddhist site, and they have their weddings in front of these really strange-looking temples because the backdrops are so interesting. So you have all these wedding photos taking place, and you have these people coming together. They have nothing to do with Buddhism. They never go inside the temple. And I've interviewed many, many of them. They will play music. They will have picnics. They will sit there for days. It's also, not only for weddings, it's really important for local teenagers because there's nothing to do here. There's nothing to do as a teenager. And they don't have money to go far away to school. They, a lot of them maybe hope to be migrant workers, maybe to get to Riyadh or to get to Singapore or something like that as migrant workers. But really, this is a very poor and very disconnected community from the region. And so, and this is an area near what's called the Tarai, but it's further east of that. And so this becomes entertainment, is that you can go on a date here, so that you can take pictures here, that you can go on a stroll around the pond in the tour here, because it's very, very different. You're seeing buildings and architecture you would never see anywhere else in the world, or anywhere else where a lot of people would be able to visit in the world. And so they have, in a sense, embodied metabolism. They have changed the place. Right here, I was with this group of teenagers here and talking with them and just kind of learning about their lives and things like that. And they would each keep handing me a camera to take pictures of them. They would all pose and take pictures and pose and take pictures. And at one time, I had over 20 cameras on arm because I would just have to keep taking one. And that really told me a lot of what was here. It's like, do you guys want to go in? I can teach you about the Buddhist symbols. And they're like, no, we're good. We just want to take the picture out front. Now we're going to go party with our friends, right? Is that it's not about Buddhist learning. It's not about meditation. It's about creating in a certain type of atmosphere. And so you have large bus groups that come in to bring these teens together, bring families together, and they bring loudspeakers and music and such. It's the least meditative place you'll ever go, is Lumbini. It's quite loud there. So, next site. So, let's move from Nepal to talk about Thailand and talk about two other architects. This is Lek and Prapai Wiriyapan. Lek and Prapai Wiriyapan were two Chinese Thais, so Sino-Thais, and they had quite a nice love story, actually. Lek was not a successful man. His father was from China, moved as a kind of an economic refugee to Siam in the early part of the 20th century, and he wanted to, make money, but he wasn't successful. He moved back to China. And so he had a son there, Lek. Lek moved back to China with him. But when Lek was 18, he said, you know what? I'm going to try to do what my father did. I'm going to try to go make money in Siam. This is a place that I think I can make some money. He had never real education of any sort, but he was a good salesperson. He was a good talker. And he said, I think on the streets I can sell stuff. I think I can make some money. And so he started to go around the major Chinatown of Bangkok, and he started to see what people liked, what people were attracted to. And he's like, whatever products people like, I want to kind of make a new version of that and become a successful business person. And he noticed that kind of little elixirs, like cure-alls, were very important in the Chinese community, and also the larger Thai community in Bangkok. And he says they love taking these like little sips of things that will make them stronger, their hair grow, or make them more virile and things like that. Because I'm going to make something like that. And I'm going to market it. And so he met this young woman, and she was a chemist, and she worked, and she's Chinese Thai as well, and she had grown up in Thailand, though. And he met her, and he was blown away by her. He just thought she was amazing, and he thought she was beautiful, but also she could make stuff, like she was a chemist. And so, and she had a serious kidney problem from a very young age, and so he was a good cook, actually. And so he would bring her these health soups that he made, and she was kind of resistant to him. Their letters back and forth are very interesting if you read. They're very sweet. And she kind of wore her down over time. She was much better educated, probably much better prospects. But he wore her down. He was charming. And he said, listen, let's start a company. You make an elixir, and I will market it. And they did. And they got successful. She made this elixir that was kind of just like liquid amphetamine, sort of. It just like gives you a jolt, right? And he called it the Mahanak brand. He didn't want to call it a Chinese name because he wanted Thais to buy it as well, not just Chinese, because the Chinese population of Bangkok is only about 10%, but he wanted a much wider customer base. He gave it a Sanskritic-sounding name with a Thai pronunciation, And it got successful. They sold a lot of it. And he goes, good, this is great. He's like, what can we do next? So he noticed that cars were getting popular in Thailand. There wasn't many cars at the time. And he says, but people want cars. And he started the first car dealership, Mercedes-Benz dealership branch in Thailand. But what he was first, he did the first showroom ever in Thailand. So this idea that you would have large glass, he had seen this in pictures. You have a showroom. So he created the first showroom in the city, and Mercedes-Benz, which no one could afford. He goes, it doesn't matter if they can afford it. I'm going to put 2 nice Mercedes in it, and everyone will look in it and want it. And then one rich people will say, this is the way I get status. I want what everybody can't get. And he was absolutely right. Hugely successful. One of the reasons the king of Thailand bought a Mercedes. And so then everybody wants to be like a king. Very successful, string of dealerships. Then he invested in golf courses. He saw after the war in Japan, the Japanese were gaining some wealth in the 1960s and 70s, but they couldn't afford to golf in Japan. There wasn't enough room, and the clubs were very exclusive. So he started designing packages where Japanese wealthy people could fly to Bangkok, be a member of a golf club in Bangkok. It's about a 4-hour flight. And that he started golf clubs. No Thais were interested in golfing, so this was largely for foreigners. Hugely successful. He started, just everything he touched was gold. But it was really Birthplace that was doing all of this. She was the money person. She was an extremely good accountant. She was an extremely good investor. She was very shrewd in negotiations. He was kind of wild all over the place, so he was kind of a visionary. But she was really good at this. And so they were this perfect team working together. And they became so wildly successful. They became millionaires many times over. And they just didn't know what to do with all their money. They had never imagined having this much money. They had 6 kids. Their kids were all rich. One of their kids became a politician in Bangkok, and a couple other successful business people as well. I've gotten to know a few of them. And so he, like a lot of wealthy people who don't know what to do with their money, they want to build a monument to themselves, right? And so he wanted to do that. He felt that he didn't have any sort of education. So he wanted to, in a sense, he felt that he could never break into Thai high society, no matter how much money he had, because he just wasn't educated enough, and he was looked down upon. He was looking as just kind of, nouveau riche, and that, he was just an interloper and things like this. And so he started buying lots and lots of books. He bought books on religion, and on philosophy and history. He seemed to have a particular affinity to Catholicism, actually. He bought lots of books on Catholicism. He was quite fascinated with it. But he was interested in Taoism. He was interested in Buddhism. But he never was religious himself. And then he started collecting art. Birthplace was working. She was managing money. She started a literary magazine. She started an archaeology magazine. She started the first kind of historical documentaries in the country, so she had this film team. So she was doing kind of a lot of serious work, and he was just traveling around a lot and just kind of collecting. He went to every province in Thailand, and he bought stuff because he could just buy things. And he had so much stuff. He bought whole temples and had them moved to his property. He bought statues. He bought a village and had the village moved, every building. He was just going crazy. And he's like, I don't know what to do with all my stuff. And she was getting mad. She was like, all of our properties, you're filling up with your junk. So he's like, okay, I'll create a museum. And he created the first Siamese Cultural Museum to celebrate all of Thai culture, to say thank you to Thailand is not his home country, but a country that he was successful in. And so he made the ancient city, and he tried to get UNESCO recognition for the ancient city. And this is kind of like the Disney World or Epcot maybe, of Thailand. So every province is represented. They have monuments from all over the country. They also have things from Cambodia and the Shan states of Burma. Parts of Malaysia were brought in. He also wanted to celebrate Thai culture by making monuments to famous Thai poems and to make the famous Thai kings and things like that. And a statue of this famous warrior queen, Suryo Thai, he made a statue for her, or had a statue made for her. And he just did this. And then Birthplace kind of was liking this. And she's like, I can do documentaries on this. And my documentary, my magazine can feature of this. And she saw herself, in a sense, as like kind of running Smithsonian Magazine or something like this. And her magazine, they've passed away, but her magazine is considered that way today. It is the premier art and society magazine in the country still. The king of Thailand comes to visit his site, but this is the site itself. These are full-size temples that he had moved. And if he couldn't move a famous temple, like if he couldn't buy it, like the community's like, we're not selling you our sacred temple, then he replicated it. He had artists come in and he said, I want the exact thing built. He built an entire village. He made waterways and canals to look like old Bangkok. It's like Williamsburg, Virginia, right? He has people dress up in period costume and they speak like old-fashioned Thai, sort of. They break down after about 2 sentences and just start speaking Thai again. But they sell like ancient ice cream and things like that. But there's my son running around, and we took my kids to these places all the time over the years. And brought in furnishings from different places. And one of the best examples from all of it, he brought in libraries from Laos, entire manuscript libraries. Entire temples from the Shan states were brought in. These are all full size. These are not miniatures in any way. Huge mansions from Ayutthaya, a giant Chinese temple from Malaysia, a floating Christian church from Malaysia, a Taoist shrine from Vietnam. And just bringing this an idea that I want to celebrate Thailand, I want to celebrate the diversity of cultures here. You can get, your haircut, an old-fashioned haircut. You can do the photo booths, the historical photo booths thing. You can buy old-fashioned candy. You can walk these old streets. And then he wanted to make a bigger atmosphere because he still had too much money. So he brought in statues from Sri Lanka, or he replicated ones from Sri Lanka. He brought in animals from all over Thailand. So you would have this animal park, not realizing, or he quickly realized, this is area infested by crocodiles. Those animals were eaten in about 2 weeks. So all of the exotic animals he brought in were very quickly eaten. You get golf carts, you can go around, and you can see, it's a massive site. This is absolutely a massive site. This is my daughter, and she's now a teenager, but that's her first visit there, and she's been there many, many times. Huge boats brought in. His father was a merchant and was on Chinese boats, so he wanted to honor his father. He built a lake and put a boat in it. He built rivers, fake barges to show commerce from the past. This is a low-lying area, absolutely below sea level. Okay, there is no hills at all here. But he wanted to create a hilltop temple, a famous hilltop temple, so he built the mountain in order to put the temple on top. Okay? So he dug out all these things for his pond, for his father's boat, and then he built the mountain and then put the replica of that temple on the mountain. It's an absolutely beautiful temple, but he said it doesn't look right unless it's on top of a mountain, so I got to build a mountain. His site was a failure. It still is. You can still go. You can go today. You can visit it. You can take tour buses from Bangkok out there. I often find myself the only person there. Sometimes school groups go through, but it's just not very. People go to Thailand to see real temples. Like they want to see, why would I go see a replica of something when I could say, or even if it is a real temple, it's not consecrated. And then Buddhists were frustrated because they couldn't treat the temples like temples. They couldn't practice in them, right? That these are monuments. So why would we go to to take a picture of a temple and not be able to practice in it when we could go to one right outside? So some school groups and architectural historians and things like that will come by, but really, and he got very frustrated. He was like, I made this great site for everybody and no one wants to visit, but he still had tons of money. And he started kind of losing it. And he starts making some questionable decisions. Another questionable thing is his wife died. So she died relatively young. And he wrote 2 long books of poetry for her. He was quite a good poet. Had paintings done of her, and he was just distraught. He just absolutely distraught. You should read his letter. He just couldn't take this. And she clearly was keeping him focused in life. And when she died, he went nuts. He built the largest metal animal on Earth. There's a 3-headed elephant. It affects the radio waves and the radio reception all around it. It's larger than the Statue of Liberty. I mean, it is absolutely massive. And there's 5 stories of museums below it, and then an elevator that goes up the leg, and a full-size Buddhist temple in the belly. You can fit 150 people in the belly at a temple. And it's a great temple, by the way. You can't see, there's windows here and things like that. But this is the temple inside the belly of the elephant. Then he said, well, I don't think we should stay in Thailand. We should move outside of it, and this should be a symbol of universality. And so all of the murals are done are of his visions of the universe and his maps of the universe. But then he collected these very, very rare statues from all over the Buddhist world, kind of to create an ecumenical Buddhist site. So you would see these very famous statues from Japan, Thailand, Korea, Burma, places like that. But then he wanted them to be under this dome of his own vision. Then he brought in German metal workers and artists to design the pillars underneath the elephant and the stained glass. And then he wanted all of the artwork in the museum to reflect all different religions from all over the world. So like some of them have the story of Christ on them, and then the other ones have like Greek myths on them. And so that he wanted to kind of say, well, it's Buddhist, but Buddhism in a sense will encompass everything, right? Then he really lost it. Then still lots of money, and his kids, they just kind of shook their heads when they were talking about this. He built the largest wooden structure on Earth. If you've ever been to the Todaiji in Nara, Japan, which was the largest wooden structure on Earth, and is an absolutely beautiful temple in Nara, and a UNESCO site, this is much bigger. And if you've seen that temple, it's shocking to have a wooden structure that big. This is massive. He bought so much coastline. They made so much money because they control so much coastline. And he has 300 workers. He's long dead. But he has funding for them for 300 live-in workers. They have schools there. They have, cafeterias, artisans, largely women from Burma who are very good wood carvers, to keep building this. And it just goes on and on and on. It keeps adding. Every time I'm there, they've added whole sections to this. Huge crews building this. You can ride elephants. You can take horses. You can buy ice cream. You can go on motorboats. You can even become Indra, the king of the gods. So if you pay about $3, you can sit on the crown. I think I look pretty good as Indra, the king of the gods, right there. But you can do that for a second. You can walk into the center of the temple and become that. And he said that these are all the workers, that this is a site that should bring together religious people from all over the world. And then he said it's no longer Buddhist, it's no longer Hindu, it's no longer any religion, it is my religion. And he created his own cosmology and his own gods, drawing from all these other religions to create this site. And, I'm the, typical white liberal anthropologist. And I go into the site and I see all these women doing the work, and I'm like, oh, they must be oppressed. You know what I mean? Like they were taken from their homelands in Burma and oppressed. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to, expose the abusive conditions. Interview after interview, they're like, this is the best job we've ever had. This is the greatest place ever. We work whenever we feel like it. It will never end. We don't really have to complete anything. Our kids get to go to school for free. The food's awesome. They're like showing me their housing. I'm like, this is amazing. I want to work here. And they're like, we have no idea what we're doing. Like we just make stuff. And they have huge warehouses of stuff. And the funny thing is, it's a failure. There's all these plans for more. Thank goodness, though, another wooden elephant will go in there. Thank goodness, he drew all, Lech was a very good artist. Thank goodness the Russians have bought a lot of the property around it, so he can't actually expand, or it would go on and on and on. But it's ecumenical in a place, and it's kind of seen as this strange place for Thai Buddhists. Final site. So, this is Shifa Jiao. He is a very famous Buddhist monk from southern China now, and has spent almost his entire life in Singapore. And he's very well known in Singapore. He's a very well-known monk in general. And the story as I met him is kind of a strange story. I wrote my dissertation in Singapore in 2002, and end of 2001, I guess. And this temple didn't exist. It started in 2008. But I knew the smaller temple that was associated that eventually became this one. And I kept going back to Singapore. I was there just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I keep going back to Singapore, and there's always meetings, there's always work to be done in Singapore. It's a big center for Buddhist studies. And this temple I've seen built from the ground up, from 2008 up, and I've just watched it being built and learned about the community. I became a consulting scholar for it. I helped, help design and do things for their museum. So deeply invested in the place, but never could meet the abbot. Like every time I tried to meet him, oh, he's busy. Oh, he's busy. And I'm like, I see him in pictures everywhere. Like I see him up on stage occasionally chanting. Like I really would love to interview him, right? And it was always an excuse, always an excuse. I was like, okay. And I was typically in Singapore again, and I'd been at the temple before, earlier in the day, and I was doing some stuff and working with some really great local scholars there, and the director of the museum is an amazing man, really just a very kind-hearted person. And I'm getting ready to catch my flight, and I'm just packing up my bags in the hotel, and I get a call, says, he'll meet you right now. I'm like, what? Okay. And I grabbed it, and I ran out, and I jumped in a cab, and I said, okay, we're going to make a stop at this temple, and I will pay, I have to meet this dude. And I jump out of the cab, I grabbed a book to give to him, because, you give a gift, right? And, I don't know what to give to him, and a notebook, and I walk into the temple, and I see my friend E, and I'm just like, sorry, I'm really, can I use the bathroom composing? And he goes, no, we're meeting him now. I go into the main hall. There's television cameras. There's groups on either side of the hall, this huge temple, chanting and focused on me. And I'm like, what? And he's standing at the end like I'm getting married to him, right? Like I'm being brought in, and E, the director of the museum, is like the father of the bride, right? And I'm like, what the fuck? And this is crazy. And he's like, nah, this has to be done. And all the cameras on me, and then it's projected on these large screens, and I'm like, okay. And I walk up, and I have to do the ceremony with them and everything like that. I still have my backpack on, right? And they're like, all these photos are taken, and then he leaves, and they're like, okay, bye, have a good flight. And I'm like, no, talking with him. No, well, you said meet him. Yeah, you met him. I'm like, no, they're like, really, do you really need to talk to him? I'm like, yes, I have to interview him. I'm a scholar. I can't not interview him. And they're like, okay, I'll come back. And they bring me up to his private chamber. And I knew this museum. I knew every inch of this museum. And I have the architectural plans, for this temple. And I never knew this secret room existed. It's not in the architectural plans. This kind of secret library he has in there with this private elevator. And I go up there, and he sits there, and he's just the greatest guy, right? But I hadn't talked to him yet. They bring me over to take a photo with him first, but they realize that I'm sitting above him because I'm taller, and that can't happen in a photo. I have to be shorter than him. So they you don't see this, but they pulled the pillows out from the couch, and then they pushed me down. They had two people hooking my shoulders down. And they're and then there's a guy with a camera saying, yeah, okay, good. And then I bounced back up. And so that's why I look quite awkward in that photo. Take the photo. I talk with him half hour, 45 minutes. Great, wonderful. Answer all my questions. Was so wonderful. And this is really no more than 40 minutes. I'm leaving. They present me all the pictures they took, blown up and in frames, wrapped. Here's your parting gift. I go, you just took that photo. They went out, had it printed, had it framed. So, Shifa Zhao, fascinating man. He wanted to design an ecumenical temple, a temple that would bring all Buddhists together. He said he was like U Thant in 1969. How do I bring all Buddhists together? And he went to this city council, and he said, I want to design a temple that looks like every temple. I want architecture from all different temples. And the Singapore building board and tourist board was very resistant to this. They're like, no, we like our Chinese to look Chinese and our Indian to look Indian. We want it to represent. He's like, no, I really want it to be a blend of different things. They fought with him, and they largely settled on something like this. You can see the 3D renderings of this. You can take virtual tours of it. It is a very, very high-tech place. It's in the Chinatown night market next to what is called the Street of the Dead, or where the coffins used to be made in the city. The wood was brought from Burma. The flags were brought from Tibet. The design is a Japanese architect based on an old Chinese Tang design. The trees out front come from Sri Lanka. This is a Chinese opera out back and kind of a performance center out back. Lots of people play cards and do chess and things like that here. And you go into it, and you have different pieces of art from all over the Buddhist world. The backdrop is Japanese. The statues themselves are Chinese, but designed by a Japanese architect. All the rest of it is designed by Tibetans. They chant in multiple languages, generally in Chinese, but often in other languages like Sanskrit and Pali. And then you can do services. You can ask to do services in a different language. The pavilions were designed to look like a Newar, central Nepal temple inside. And you have women and you have men from all different parts of the Buddhist world come in. And this was designed to be this, and that's what they tried to do at first. It largely failed in some ways, and it was successful in others. You can donate money to have a statue put up from different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas throughout the world. And you can get your name on one of the statues, or you don't have to put your name on it if you don't want to. You can donate online through their site. You can scan your phone now. This is a new thing that you can scan and donate. And they're generating lots and lots of money. And so every person can have their hand upon it. So if you want to donate just this piece of wood or just this chair, or you can donate plates in the cafeteria downstairs. It's a very nice cafeteria. And then they invite groups from all over the Buddhist world. Burmese monks, Sri Lankans, and things like that come in. I remember one time I went there, and I was on the loop. So I was just like, oh, you do this for all the visitors, right? And they just have the loop to show how international they are, and they really want to promote it. Cafes and bookstores. It's a very nice cafe and bookstore, but 2 years later, they said, they ripped it out and put a new one in. So they're always changing. You can buy Buddhist robes and Buddhist gifts and things like that. Buddhist scriptures, very nice sets of manuscripts from different parts of the Buddhist world. On the roof of this is an incredibly nice Buddhist garden, and there's a large prayer wheel. If you know anything about Tibetan prayer wheels, a very, very large prayer wheel, as large as the stage, really. Huge prayer wheel up there that you can go on your lunch break, and you can spin the prayer wheel. The Buddhist Museum, this is recently, I was just there, it's been recently redone. The Nagapushma Museum, showing the life of the Buddha over time. And if you go there and you read the English, that is my English. That was my contribution to the translations. And then statues from all this. So you have a Thai statue next to a Tibetan statue next to a Bhutanese statue. And you'll find this in each area. You have Burmese and Lao and Japanese all mixed together. Thai statue next to a Chinese statue next to a Tibetan statue here. And then you can go and make offerings either online or in person. Another thing, though, that makes this a very interesting place. So, like the two other sites I'm talking about, efforts to make it ecumenical, efforts to bring Buddhists from all over the world in, efforts to highlight the glories of Buddhist history, the glories of Buddhist teachings in general. So, have plaques on the wall about the Buddha was born here, and then he traveled here, and then this great saint was here, and then he went here. And so there's maps everywhere to see maps. And so Lumbini is doing this, and Lekwirepan was trying to do this in the ancient city, and Birthplace was trying to do it with her work in magazines and in documentaries. And Sifat Zhao has been trying to do this, and this idea that I don't want to be a Chinese Buddhist, I don't want to be a Singaporean Buddhist, I want to be a Buddhist in general. And I want to create what Buddhism has never had, and this kind of universality to it. But what they've discovered over time is that tourists will come into the temple, they'll take a few pictures, they might eat in the cafeteria, which is quite good downstairs, but then they'll leave after about 15, 20 minutes. They might go to the garden on their lunch break if they're local. But this idea that you would have multiple Buddhists performing ceremonies there from all over the world, that's really never been successful at all. They want to go to their own temples of their own places and chant in their own languages and things like that and be around their own people. And so it's been a little disappointing. They had these Buddhist photography contests where Buddhists all over the world could donate photos from different places and have contests that large. They used to have a Buddhist lecture series of different Buddhists from all over the world, and that has failed. They had a Buddhist film series, and that has gone by the wayside. And so all of these things to make it ecumenical failed. But what has been really, really successful is the local Chinese Buddhist community coming and doing ceremonies on the one hand, but this, and that is funerals. So this is where you would have your ancestor kind of plaque that you would go, and so you would have your mother, your father, or relatives buried, but then you would honor them, you'd have a plaque there, and that you would come and you say prayers and do offerings, which is much more common than going to a cemetery. You go to a central place to do this. Lee Kuan Yew, the former head of Singapore, Prime Minister of Singapore, he's there too. And so this is really, really a place where most people are coming. They're there to offer gifts. They are there to honor their families, and they are members. And a lot of the money are coming from these members who have a stake in the temple. This temple supports about 30 different orphanages and different temples throughout Burma. They give away millions and millions and millions of dollars every year. They're incredibly well-respected charitable organization and really have promoted charity and really good neighbors. Like they're incredibly supportive and kind. And their art collection is very impressive, and they're very good curators and preservers of art. Like in every way, this temple is the model of what you should do to help a community. But this effort to be international, in many cases, what is reigned is being local. And what I like in the directors and the supporters and the curators of the museum there have really stressed to me, and I really respect this, is that they want to be a symbol of Buddhist universalism, but they also want to be attentive and caring to their local Buddhist community. And so they've become an international temple that has become local. And they, you can see that they want to be international too, so they come, and I would speak like I'm speaking here. I would speak there with local monks and local scholars. This was just 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago. But I'll leave it for questions there. So thanks.